Welcome to Village Church Connections. I'm David Pavey. Some years ago, when my wife Nancy and I were serving God in Europe, we would often drive long distances in the course of our ministry. As we traveled, we would frequently invest the time listening to sermons by the hour. One that made an impression on me was by Pastor Ernie Baxter of Vancouver in British Columbia. It was entitled Eagle Christians, and he told a story that touched my heart. Now, I stumbled across this story again recently, and it challenged me once again. So let me recount it for you, and I'll tell it in the first person as if I'm Baxter himself. I'm eternally indebted to my maternal grandmother. In my study at home, there's one picture on the wall, only one. And if you walk into my study, you'll see straight ahead of you, in a simple frame, a gray-haired woman who was to me God's agent. As a boy, I came a little early for young parents to want to be bothered with me. And they wanted to have a good time, so Grandma was my babysitter. Right from early days, I remember Grandma. I recall the little cottage with a picket fence and all the Saturday mornings when I would go there. I remember all those gorgeous things that would come out of that great stove oven. Homemade buns, homemade bread, homemade cakes, not food you picked off a shelf. And then came those 3 or 4 years of awful rebellion when I was in my teens. I drifted away from the Lord. My father thought I was no good, and with reason. My mother grieved over me, but it was Grandma who helped me come back to God. She had come to live with us by then, and as I would come home, sometimes at 3 or 4 in the morning, I would see the light under her door, and I heard my name repeated quietly, and I knew what she was doing. She was on her knees praying for me. When God got hold of my life and I went into the ministry, Grandma came out to Vancouver to be near me. When I began to preach, Grandma would always be there, sitting about 4 rows from the front with a banana smile from ear to ear on her face, knowing that she had invested several hours of prayer already in that sermon. I'm not sure she ever heard a thing I said. She just sat there and beamed. It was almost as if she was saying quietly, "We did it, Lord, didn't we?" Oh, I was a great preacher. I knew my homiletics and my hermeneutics. I knew how to put a sermon together with an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Now, Grandma prayed for me 4 hours per day, and that was nice of her, but I really didn't need it. I'd visit Grandma several times per week. I loved to visit her, and she'd have little slices of pineapple for me. But one day I went to visit her, and she said, "I think I'm going home." I said, "But Grandma, you are home." "No," she said, "I'm going home to heaven." I said, "Grandma, you can't do that." She said, "I am. I've given notice from my room." It was almost as if she and the Lord had arranged it, and I think they had. "No, Ern," she said, "no. I'm going back to the prairies to say goodbye to the children, and then I'm going home." And sure enough, she went back to the prairies. She wrote all her Christmas cards, got into bed, and called the preacher in. He read her favorite psalm to her, but she was already 2 verses ahead of him by memory, which is a bit embarrassing after all. And when she had attended to everything, like the patriarch of old, she drew her feet up into her bed, breathed her last, and went home. I went to the funeral and then returned to Vancouver. On Sunday morning, I stood up in my pulpit, opened my Bible and my sermon notes, and I started to preach, but nothing came out. I cleared my throat and started again, but nothing would come out. And I said to myself, there's something wrong. And the Lord said, you bet there's something wrong. And I said, oh God, you mean? And he said, that's what I mean. In front of my congregation, I put my head on the pulpit and I began to weep. And I said, oh Lord, I've been a wicked, stupid, blind boy. Then I told him, she's gone. And this morning I'm as empty as a barrel. Grandma's hours of prayer had been sustaining me, and I had been too proud to know it. And I said, oh God, forgive me. There was one old colored sister in my church. I'll never forget it. While I was still weeping in humiliation before my congregation, she stood up, full of years, and she said, Pastor, I'll be your grandma. Now, in those days, I was traveling around the world. I'd preach on a Sunday morning and tell them I had to leave quickly to catch a plane. But that old sister would be outside my vestry door. I would come out with my briefcase, and she'd take me to her ample bosom, and she'd pull my head against her old black grey hair, and she'd nuzzle me against her cheek, and she'd say, my son, y'all remember, wherever you're going, and I don't know where you're going, but I know you're going, and you remember that back home here you got a grandma. I want you to know, I've got so many grandmas across the country now, you couldn't count them. I keep supplied with grandmas. I've got grandmas in every town. I was in one place recently, and a little 15-year-old girl came up to me when I told this story, and she said, this may sound rather strange, but would it be all right if I was your grandma? I said, you're the youngest one I ever had, but I'll take you. So that's the end of the story. But here's a question for you. Are you a grandma for someone today? Would anyone notice if you stopped praying for them? Thank you for tuning in to Village Church Connections.